Hello and welcome to another episode of Everyone's a Critic. My name is Ryan Cohen and today I'll be reviewing the new Netflix original movie, The Boys in the Band. The movie is about a group of friends, all of whom are gay men, who host a birthday party for one of the members of the group. When an unexpected visitor crashes the party, all of the members of the group are forced to confront internalized conflicts between themselves and other members of the group, and even a few within themselves. Now, the movie was adapted from a 1968 stage play written by Mark Crowley, an openly gay man himself. And it also takes inspiration from a 1970 movie adaptation directed by William Friedkin, as well as a 2018 revival of the stage play. So with all that background information out of the way, let's get straight into the review. I'll start with a few very vague and brief non-spoiler thoughts before I delve a little deeper into some thoughts that will definitely veer into spoiler territory. Now, overall, great film. I definitely loved it. The writing is sharp and witty, the direction and cinematography is compelling more often than it is not, and the performances in particular are excellent. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect. The script can definitely get a little clunky at times, and some of the ensemble cast characters are a little too undercooked and not quite as compelling, but overall, the movie is poignant, memorable, and definitely worth watching. So with that very vague and generic review out of the way, let's get a little more in depth to some spoiler thoughts. Now, as I mentioned, the script was exemplary, sharp, witty, and carefully constructed. It felt like a very authentic portrayal of the source material. Now, I, as a straight man who's living in the modern times, am not remotely qualified to say whether or not it's an authentic portrayal, but I have seen enough buzz online from people who are qualified to say whether or not the movie is authentic that it is authentic and does do a good job representing the experience, so I feel very safe in saying that. And I'll delve a little bit into this a little bit later on, but you can definitely feel the authenticity in how the movie writes its characters. And again, it's unsurprising that the movie is such an authentic experience, given that Mark Crowley, who wrote the stage play and also co-wrote the screenplay for this movie with Ned Martell, is an openly gay man himself. So I think that's actually one of the best things about this movie is the script's authenticity and the way it reflects its authenticity most specifically by writing its characters with nuance. Pretty much no one in the ensemble cast, the main 9 characters, is universally or always likable or unlikable. And in fact, I found myself doing a 180 on a number of those characters quite quickly. Most notably, Andrew Reynolds as Donald after his fight with Hank, when he becomes shockingly likable shockingly quickly. It's an incredibly realistic portrayal of gay men, not just as people who are gay and people whose identity is centered entirely around them being gay, but also just as regular people. A lot of the conflicts in the movie didn't have anything to do with their sexuality, and for as much as it could be, that was really refreshing to see. Gay men being treated like men, just like people, instead of solely being defined by their sexuality. Now, the direction of Joe Mantello is generally tight and effective. Mantello actually directed the 2018 Broadway stage revival of the original play, and so he's making the transition to motion pictures here, and it's a surprisingly effective transition. There are a few different examples that I can think of that show how the direction is effective, but specifically, I like how the movie often goes like even minutes without making a cut. It'll often follow, basically zip around the entire apartment from one character or one section of the apartment to another without making a cut. So it's almost a panorama from different parts of the action as the script goes. It's an incredibly effective technique that works really well. Another example of effective direction is Harold's entrance, Zachary Quinto's character. He is built up to be more or less a big deal, a big kahuna, just by the way that he is framed in his entrance. And you can very much feel that in the direction, and it makes his entrance stick with a lot more gusto than it normally would have. So I'd also specifically like to mention the performances, easily the best part of the film. The highlight is undeniably Jim Parsons, who delivers a layered and complex portrayal of Michael. He begins to become more unlikable and more steely as he gets progressively more drunk and more aggressive, something that's set up quite well and effectively early in the movie, and then eventually leading to his meltdown and the breakdown after that, where Michael becomes more human again. It's an incredibly effective curve of a character arc, and Parsons was absolutely the right man to portray it. It helps, of course, that he'd had a lot of experience portraying Michael on stage, but naturally that just made him an even better fit. Probably the second best performance in the show is Zachary Quinto's Harold, deliciously sardonic in every conceivable way. But most of the rest of the ensemble cast do deserve shout-outs, specifically Brian Hutchison and Tuke Watkins, whose performances are fairly underplayed, but they become infinitely more compelling even after their more subtle portrayals when the two characters meet each other and start to develop their own little romantic tension. Andrew Reynolds, who didn't stick out to me that much as Larry until he proves his skill in the later half of the film when his conflict with Hank really starts to take off, and then that in of itself explodes, and that was when I realized, okay, Andrew Reynolds definitely has the talent to pull this off for sure. Robin DeJesus, a scene stealer who immediately steals the movie, more or less as soon as he enters, and he does eventually get his own moment to shine when it's his turn to play the game. And it's a very effective utilization of that character in that moment. And Michael Benjamin Watson, who is initially fairly charming but unremarkable, but then he ends up getting perhaps the most poignant, engaging, and compelling subplot of any of the ones in the film. And unfortunately, I don't really feel like that got the payoff that it truly deserved. We sort of just leave Bernard at the end of the movie as still somewhat of a wreck from the phone call, but he's recovering. And that's not really as engaging or as compelling of a payoff as I think I would have liked. Now, moving a little more into some of the negatives of the film, the only two disappointments in the cast were Matt Bomer's Donald and Charlie Carver's Cowboy. Now, Cowboy was just a fairly two-dimensional cardboard character. He doesn't really have much arc or much growth. He never becomes anything more than he already is at the start of the movie. And that's more or less by design, so I'm not too upset with the movie about it. But of the nine, he was easily the least compelling character. And Cowboy's a fairly minor character, so again, not necessarily that big of a deal. And he does make for some funny one-liners, and he does get some funny moments in, not that big of a deal. More disappointing is Matt Bomer's Donald being so uninteresting and so insignificant. Matt Bomer was one of the most heavily featured actors in the marketing for this movie, and unfortunately, while he as a performer is fine, he doesn't get much to work with when it comes to the script. Donald is only ever interesting in the context of his relationship to other characters and never in of himself, and that's genuinely unfortunate. So a few other negatives about the movie, and these are fairly minor, but they are worth mentioning. The script is often a little too extravagant for its own good. Occasionally, there's a line that's weighed down by bulkiness or clunkiness, and as a result, it doesn't quite land. This doesn't happen that often, but it does happen frequently enough that I felt the need to mention it. As I've previously mentioned, another problem with the film is that not all of the ensemble characters truly land. Matt Bomer's Donald and Charlie Carver's Cowboy are not quite as well developed as, or engaging as I'm sure would have been preferable. Not that big of a deal for Cowboy, definitely a disappointment for Donald, though. Finally, a few critics have addressed or have raised the point that the movie doesn't really have anything new to say or anything new insight-wise that separates it from the 2018 revival. And to put into context very briefly, The Boys in the Band was, for about a decade or so after it came out, or around a decade or so after it came out, it began to be considered outdated because it portrays, or many perceived it as portraying gay men as catty, narcissistic, in it just for themselves. And so it had a fairly solid reputation, but it was considered to be a little outdated until the 2018 revival, which modernized it and used those same tactics and techniques to bring into question more or less the authenticity of the experience, as well as to add new layers and new depth and new poignance to the original stage play, which made it feel more relevant and timely again. Now that same thing very much happens in the movie, but a lot of critics who have seen the 2018 stage revival also feel that it's not really separating itself from the stage version any more than it already is. Now, I have not seen the stage version, the revival, so I can't comment on this. I did feel it was worth bringing up. But I will say that the story is poignant and memorable enough by itself that I think it's worth watching, and I think it's a good film by itself, even if it doesn't have much to say or to differentiate itself from the original stage version. The story is very much strong enough to carry itself on its own merits, even if it's more or less the same thing as the revival. So some final thoughts or conclusions. This movie is absolutely worth seeing. The writing is sharp, witty, the script is well constructed, not perfect, it's definitely a little clunky at times, but it gets the job done far more often than it does not. The direction and cinematography is surprisingly strong, given that the director of the film was a veteran of the Broadway stage and hadn't had as much motion picture experience until he stepped up to do this film. And the acting in specific is absolutely what you're going to remember most from this movie. Jim Parsons is a standout, but Zachary Quinto, Brian Hutchison, Tuke Watkins, Andrew Reynolds, Michael Benjamin Watson, Robin DeJesus, even Matt Bomer all do serviceable, if not excellent. That concludes my review of The Boys in the Band. Make sure to follow MUTV on social media, Instagram and Twitter, at MUTV23, and to check out our website, mutv.missouri.edu. I'm Ryan Cohen for E23. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you.